The cost of staying too long. You don't stay because it's right. You stay because you're afraid of what leaving means. There's a quiet discomfort that builds inside you, not loud enough to force action, but persistent enough to drain you over time. You start telling yourself that things will change, that patience is strength, that enduring is maturity. But beneath all of that reasoning, there's something more honest. You avoid facing the fear of disrupting what has already become familiar. Walking away feels like loss, like uncertainty, like stepping into something undefined. So you stay, not because it serves you, but because it feels safer than the unknown. What most people don't realize is that staying too long sends a signal, not just to others, but to yourself. Every moment you tolerate something that quietly diminishes you, you begin to redefine your own standards. People around you don't consciously decide to value you less, they simply adjust to the version of you that accepts less. Familiarity starts to blur your boundaries. The more accessible you become, the less intentional others are with your presence. It's not always disrespect in the obvious sense, it's a slow erosion, subtle, almost invisible, where your importance is no longer felt with the same weight. There is a tension here that most people ignore. On one side, you feel the discomfort of staying, the quiet frustration, the internal resistance, the sense that something is not aligned. On the other side, you feel the discomfort of leaving, the uncertainty, the questions, the fear of what comes next. And so you remain stuck between two discomforts, choosing the one that feels more familiar rather than the one that leads to growth. This is where most people lose their authority over their own life. Not in dramatic decisions, but in small moments of hesitation where they choose comfort over clarity. The realization, when it comes, is not loud. It's subtle and almost unsettling. You begin to see that your presence has become expected, not respected, that your consistency has been interpreted as permanence. And permanence, in the absence of boundaries, removes urgency. People don't question your absence because they don't expect it. They don't adjust their behavior because they assume you will remain the same. This is the hidden cost of staying too long. You become predictable in a way that reduces your psychological presence. The shift happens when you start to understand that leaving is not an act of rejection, but an act of definition. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about restoring alignment between what you feel and what you allow. Walking away is not dramatic when it comes from clarity. It is quiet, controlled, and intentional. It does not require explanation, because it is not a reaction, it is a decision. And in that decision, something changes internally. You stop negotiating with discomfort that no longer serves you. At that point, you are no longer someone who remains out of fear or attachment. You become someone who recognizes when something has reached its natural limit and moves accordingly. You begin to understand that staying is not always loyalty, and leaving is not always loss. Sometimes, staying is avoidance, and leaving is the first honest action you take toward yourself. Absence is a language few understand. The moment you stop explaining yourself, everything around you begins to shift in ways most people never anticipate. There's a habit people develop over time: the need to justify their choices, to make others comfortable with their decisions, to soften their actions with explanations. It feels responsible, even respectful. But beneath that behavior is a subtle dependency, the need to be understood in order to feel secure. And that need quietly reduces your authority. Because the more you explain, the more you position yourself as someone who requires permission to act. What most people fail to notice is that value is rarely recognized in constant presence. It is recognized in contrast. When something is always available, always accessible, always responding, it becomes predictable. And predictability removes psychological tension. There is no space for curiosity, no room for interpretation, no reason for others to reflect on your absence. You become part of the background of their experience rather than something they actively consider. This is not because they intend to overlook you, but because the human mind adapts quickly to what feels permanent. Absence interrupts that pattern. It introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty forces attention. When you remove your presence without noise, without explanation, without emotional display, something subtle begins to happen. People start to notice the gap, not immediately, and not always consciously, but gradually. They begin to question what changed, what they missed, what they no longer have access to. And this questioning creates a different kind of awareness, one that presence alone could never achieve. There is a social pattern at play here that operates quietly beneath most interactions. People do not measure value based on what is given, they measure it based on what can be lost. When something is constantly present, its absence is never considered. But when it is removed, even subtly, its impact becomes visible. This is why absence, when used with clarity, carries a weight that words cannot replicate. It is not about withdrawing to provoke a reaction. It is about stepping back in a way that allows reality to reveal itself without interference. The leverage point lies in understanding that silence combined with absence is not emptiness, it is space. And within that space, people project their own thoughts, assumptions, and realizations. They begin to interpret your absence in ways that often carry more weight than anything you could have said. This is where psychological presence is created. Not through constant interaction, but through controlled distance that allows perception to deepen. The shift in mindset happens when you no longer feel the need to maintain your position through visibility. You begin to understand that being seen constantly is not the same as being valued, and that sometimes, the most effective way to reinforce your presence is to remove it, not as a strategy, but as a natural expression of self-respect and clarity. You stop trying to manage how others perceive you, and instead allow your absence to speak in ways that require no explanation. In that state, you become someone who is not defined by constant interaction, but by selective presence. Someone who does not need to be understood immediately, because your actions are aligned with your standards. And in that alignment, there is a quiet authority that does not seek attention, yet is felt more deeply precisely because it is not always there. Discipline means leaving without noise. You already know when something is no longer right, but you hesitate. Not because you lack awareness, but because your emotions resist the action that awareness demands. There is a conflict that most people live with quietly: the clarity of what should be done, and the discomfort of actually doing it. You see the pattern, you feel the misalignment, you recognize the shift in energy, yet you remain. Not out of ignorance, but because leaving requires a level of internal control that most people have never trained. What makes this difficult is not the situation itself, but the emotional attachment tied to it. You don't just walk away from circumstances, you walk away from expectations, from imagined outcomes, from the version of reality you once believed would exist. And that creates resistance. The mind begins to negotiate, to delay, to rationalize. It tells you to wait a little longer, to give it one more chance, to avoid making a decision that feels final. This is where discipline becomes necessary, not as force, but as alignment between what you see and what you do. Most people misunderstand discipline. They think it is about pushing harder, staying longer, enduring more. But in this context, discipline is the ability to act without emotional interference. It is the ability to leave without needing a reaction, without needing closure, without needing the situation to resolve itself in a way that feels satisfying. Because the truth is, many situations never provide that clarity. They fade, they shift, they dissolve without explanation. And if your ability to move forward depends on receiving closure, you will remain tied to things long after they have lost their meaning. There is a subtle principle here that defines emotional control. If your actions are dictated by how you feel in the moment, then your environment has control over you. But if your actions are guided by what you understand, even when it conflicts with how you feel, then you begin to establish internal authority. Walking away without noise is one of the clearest expressions of that authority. It is not reactive, it is not dramatic, it does not seek acknowledgement. It is simply a decision carried out with precision. Boundaries are not always spoken. In fact, the most effective ones rarely are. They are demonstrated through behavior. When you continue to stay in situations that do not respect your standards, you send a signal not just to others, but to yourself that your boundaries are flexible, that they can be adjusted, negotiated, or ignored. And over time, this weakens your sense of control. But when you leave quietly, without explanation, you reinforce something internally. You confirm that your standards are not dependent on external validation. The transformation that follows is not immediate, but it is profound. You begin to trust your own decisions more. You stop second-guessing what you already know to be true. The need to explain yourself fades, because your actions are no longer driven by the desire to be understood. They are driven by clarity. And in that clarity, there is a calmness that replaces the internal conflict you once felt. At that point, leaving is no longer an emotional event. It becomes a natural response to misalignment. You do not wait for situations to break you, you recognize when they no longer serve you, and adjust accordingly. And in doing so, you shift from being someone who reacts to circumstances, to someone who defines them. The quiet power of no return. Imagine reaching a point where you no longer look back after making a decision. Not because you are forcing yourself forward, but because something inside you has settled. There is no lingering doubt, no urge to revisit what you left, no need to check if things changed. That version of you does not exist through effort, it exists through clarity. And that clarity changes the way you move through every situation. What most people never fully understand is what happens when you detach completely. Not partially, not temporarily, but fully. When you remove your emotional investment from something that once held your attention, the dynamic shifts in a way that is difficult to explain. The connection that once influenced your thoughts, your reactions, your decisions, it loses its hold. And when that hold disappears, so does the control it had over you. There is something else that follows this detachment. People begin to feel the absence differently. Not because you made a statement, not because you announced your departure, but because your presence is no longer available in the same way. When you are truly gone mentally, emotionally, and physically, others are left with something they cannot immediately process. They cannot engage with you the way they once did. They cannot rely on your consistency. And in that gap, questions begin to form. This is where the deeper principle of authority becomes visible. Power is not in holding on. It is in knowing that you can leave without hesitation. When your decisions are not influenced by attachment, you become difficult to pull back into situations that no longer align with you. You are not reacting to what others say or do. You are operating from a position that is internally defined, and because of that, it is not easily disrupted. Over time, this creates a long-term shift in how you are perceived. People begin to recognize that your presence is not guaranteed, that when you leave, you do not return in the same way. This changes the way they approach you, not through fear, but through awareness. They understand that your boundaries are not temporary, that your decisions carry weight because they are not easily reversed. Internally, the change is even more significant. You stop carrying unfinished emotional ties. You stop replaying past situations, questioning whether you should have stayed or left differently. Your mind becomes quieter, not because nothing happens, but because you are no longer attached to outcomes that are already behind you. Your focus shifts forward, not out of force, but because there is nothing pulling you back. As this becomes your default state, your identity begins to consolidate around a simple principle: you do not remain where you are not aligned. You do not revisit what you have already understood. You do not reopen what you have already closed. And in that consistency, your presence becomes defined not by how long you stay, but by how clearly you move. At that point, walking away is no longer a difficult decision. It is a natural extension of who you have become.